It's been another sleepless final week of session for the Massachusetts legislature, with as much left on the cutting room floor as was sent over to the governor while the House and Senate hashed out differences far into the morning of August 1st. One of the bills to squeak through on July 31st? That was new legislation on salary transparency, which is being touted as a way to gauge and start to address wage gaps between demographics. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. I talked last week with Kim Borman, Executive Director of the Boston Women's Workforce Council, about the state of the gendered wage gap and why measuring and addressing it is such a complicated question. So let's get into it. Kim, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we have to start out with a bit of homework here because wage gaps are often a pretty prickly issue. For context, in a speech in March, marking National Equal Pay Day, President Joe Biden noted that the women's labor force participation is the highest it has been in decades, and the gender pay gap is the narrowest it has ever been on record. But, and there's a big but there, nationally, women working full-time and year-round are paid an average of 84 cents for every dollar paid to men, and in more than 90% of occupations, women earn less than men, which he noted is a product of systemic barriers and the gendered weight of caregiving responsibilities. So, we're going to get into local numbers in a moment, but let's actually start with the concept of a wage gap itself. How has talking about what the wage gap means in terms of gender, which is, of course, tied in with other factors like race or physical ability, changed over the course of your career, Kim?
I think people have always thought of the wage gap as equal pay for equal work. Remember, this has been the law since 1963, but you often hear people saying, of course, we want people who are in the same job, doing the same work, being paid the same as, women being paid the same as their male colleagues. But there's more to the wage gap than that. And people have started to realize that over the years. And where the Boston Women's Workforce Council tries to put attention is on this idea of advancement of women, advancement of people of color overall, because the way that we look at the wage gap, the way that we do the math is the same way that the National Equal Pay Days are put together, and it's unadjusted, meaning that there is no education experience. What that takes into account then is the idea of what's the compensation for men and what's the compensation for women at your workplace. And when you do that, you start to see that it's because women don't have higher salaries. And why don't they have higher salaries? Because they're not being promoted. And that's really tough to get at. Like, what's going on there that you may be paying all of your people the same wage at lower level positions. But if men are being promoted at a much higher rate, they're getting senior salaries much more. And that's really what has become sort of the nuance in the wage gap over the last couple of years.
Look, I'm almost 32, and this has been the discussion my entire lifetime. I was born in the year of the woman, yada, yada, 1992. So the discussion, as long as I've been alive, has sort of started with the concept of what I would call wage gap skepticism, this idea that there wasn't even really a gap to begin with. But it sounds like it's evolved into, as you note, a more nuanced look at what we mean when we both define the gap itself and then kind of try and look at those underlying causes. So are you still seeing a level of skepticism about it existing, or is it more pivoted into the idea that this might just be because of personal choices or societal structures?
There is still skepticism, and it usually is followed by, well, didn't people choose this? Or aren't you looking, especially because we look at the raw wage gap, again, the unadjusted wage gap. People, well, that's not fair. Why aren't you looking at education? Why aren't you looking at experience? Because you need to start from the basics. So if you do your math, and that's what we always say to our members, do the math. If you have a large gap between what your men and your women are being paid, it's as simple as that. Start to go into a deep dive into your numbers. And then you can start to see, yes, if people have more education than others or more experience, there is a reason for that. But let's face it, we've got the last thing I saw was the majority of people graduating from college were women. The majority of people graduating from law school were women. Yet you still see these huge gaps. What are you telling me? That these women aren't good enough, that, they've got the same experience, they've got the same education. Why aren't they being advanced? Why aren't their salaries becoming the same as the male colleagues? So that's kind of where I am with the skepticism. It's out there. And that is one of the things that we try to do is pay attention to the intangible barriers, which are, of course, always much harder to prove and get rid of because they are intangible.
So let's look at some of those numbers then. Let's talk Boston. The city proper sits at a bit below 700,000 people. Greater Boston is now pushing 5 million. How are the women doing?
This year, the women are doing better. There's still a gap of 21 cents. By the way, I should say that this 21 cents, the way we compute it, I mean, we are the only game in town and in the nation that looks at it through payroll data off of our members. So it's about as accurate as can be. You talked about President Biden saying, the gap was closer to 18 cents. That's done by, they're using census data, which of course, is like you call somebody up and they have to remember, what did I get in terms of a salary? Did I get a raise? Did I get a bonus? Ours, again, comes right off the payroll data, payroll system. So it's very accurate. So we are very happy that we saw a decrease because the year we do them every 2 years, our measurements. So in 2021, it was 30 cents. So it went down to 21 cents. That's a 30% decrease. We did not see the same thing in the racial wage gap. Again, all men and women, but that actually went up. It went up 4 cents, and it went from 24 cents up to 27 cents. So that is extremely disappointing and something we need to work on in the city of Boston.
Of course, that 2-year jump and thinking about what the last few years has looked like, is there anything that you noticed that changed either by industry or by other kind of tangible dive into it data place over the course of the pandemic? Because that shuffled a lot of industries in a pretty meaningful way, including, what was it, the Great Resignation, where a lot of different workers did say that the way that they were being paid or the way that companies were handling their employment wasn't quite working for them. So what has the last, let's say, 2 cycles of this data told you about shifts in the workforce?
It's a great question because that's exactly what we look for. And we did see that the percentage of women in the highest paying job categories, say like a senior VP and then the C-suite, increased by 3% and 2% respectively. So that's not bad. We also saw across the board a 6% raise for women, and we did not see the same for men. So there was attention paid to this issue. If there's any silver lining around the pandemic, that there was some attention paid to it. People started to realize, they started to do the math. There are very few employers who do this on purpose. It's just if you aren't looking at it honestly, continuously, it changes. So that is what we saw in terms of women and why we think there was this decrease in the gender wage gap. When you look at the racial wage gap, why did it go up? Well, in particular, we saw this overrepresentation of people of color in 2 industries in particular. We get these industries from the federal government. They're not so great, but they're called labor and operatives. They happen to be the industries where you need no training. And so you can start the job almost from day one, but it also doesn't give you any ability to be promoted. And so you're never going to get out of sort of the salary range that you're in if you're in those jobs. So we think that's what we really saw happen over the last couple of years.
Diving into one point that you raised there is, I've noticed that in kind of reviewing pushback to the concept of addressing a wage gap, or even again acknowledging where the wage gap might be coming from to begin with, there's a certain amount of defensiveness that seems to come up around the company's part, the idea that all discrimination must be intended, or that it would, be classified as discrimination because there are these disparities. So could you dive a little bit into that dynamic, parsing the question of, is a wage gap definitionally a problem? Is it definitionally showing you something about discriminatory policy, or is it signaling some other kind of harder to parse things?
Again, at least among our members, who we call the heroes, nobody's looking to be discriminatory. They're not trying to be. It has to do with really doing the work to figure out how employees are being paid in your company and whether it's fair and how they're being promoted. And it is intangible. So we did an intervention study, which is a policy study, practice study of what was out there and what was seeming to work. In 2020, we are actually going to update it in 2024, including some of the things that we learned out of COVID. And there are things that employers are starting to do because they realize that that helps bring in new talent that is more diverse and then also promote. So there are things that we see our members doing on purpose, whether it be something like recruiting at historically Black colleges, or putting together programs with some of the training groups in town, say like Year Up, which happens to be a national training group for certain positions so that they can come in with a curriculum, perhaps not a graduate degree, but with a curriculum that then allows them to be promoted once they're there. There are different things that people are trying to close the gender and racial wage gaps. So I don't think it's discrimination from we don't think these people can do the work. It's not that at all. It's just a kind of, they were kind of not looking for it. And now when you start to look for it and you see it, you can do something about it.
Looking at a few of those policy options, when you've been trying to assess the efficacy of any one of them, how do you try and figure out if a certain policy approach is effective? And then have there been any that have really stood out? You mentioned kind of targeted recruitment, but if you're thinking about promotion as a big driver issue, what is the policy solution to that, given that, this happens in a mix of public and private spaces?
So first of all, we always say there's no silver bullet. And the reason we give out these things called the Wage Equity Impact Awards. We just did that in June, so people can go to our website and see who just won. But I'm going to give you an example from a few years back, which I think still stands out as something where it took a little ingenuity, but it happened during the pandemic. And it was actually Mass General Brigham, who the doctor at that point, who was head of Dr. Bradella, who was head of professional development for doctors. And believe it or not, doctors don't just get promoted because they save lives. They have to do extracurricular things too. She noticed that women in particular were not signing up to do what's called grand rounds, visiting tours, which means that you either have to go across the nation or across the ocean to, say, Europe, and you have to, for 6 months, be a part of a different hospital and lead that hospital's group. And women who tend to be the caretakers at home couldn't sign up and leave. So guess what? All of a sudden the pandemic came and nobody was leaving. So the program turned to online, and she got all these women to sign up because they didn't have to leave their homes anymore. And she saw an incredible, almost a 30% increase in the amount of women, and 10% of those women were then promoted. So the last time we spoke, Mass General Brigham was trying to get money to make online a part of the entire process. Sure, there still will always be a place for people to go in person, but if you can't, should it deny you from this opportunity to be advanced? Those are some of the kind of ideas that came out of the pandemic that I think are working and will continue and hopefully help marginalized groups become more promoted more easily.
Can we probe for a second into, I think, what that's connected to, which is the question of how this ties in with social change and social evolution and innovation over time? It was not all that long ago that the concept of someone calling in to do a job would be considered, laziness or something like that. But we've just gone through multiple years of the entire state government essentially zooming in and voting on laws. But we're now in a complicated sort of push back and forth into back to work in person, some hybrid opportunities, some things have gone fully remote. How are you thinking about the ability to plan for the long range based on where we're at now, because we don't know, for instance, if there's going to be, based on office space demand, a push for in 5 years everybody to just be fully back regardless of where the technology has gone.
The word is flexibility and being able to work with your employees to make decisions that work both for you as an employer and for your employees, because you don't want to lose people. You also have to decide what is good for your business. So we've seen a lot of companies put into effect flexible scheduling, which means that people do come in, but they come in at different times so that they can get their kids to school. It might be very early or later in the day. We have seen a lot of hybrid work continue. Fully remote is still there. Interestingly enough, a lot of younger people want to come back into the office, and that's not a bad thing, because I think that being in the office with other people, you learn a lot. It's just through osmosis. However, if you don't have anyone else in the office and you're just on a Zoom call, it seems a little worthless. So yes, it's a long way of saying it's still being worked out. And in fact, I'm waiting to see where the research really ends up with the whole idea of hybrid and flexibility. Did it help women? Did it not help women? My guess is going to be in individual situations. There's going to be some times where it helps and times when it doesn't.
So how is the gap persisting across private and public institutions? Is the approach to addressing the gap or identifying the gap different, or are we seeing kind of the same systems, the same barriers?
The public sector has a lot more union-based employees, and that is tougher because you're working with actual contracts that have to be set out years in advance. So we have been working with a lot of the representatives from different cities, because they are members also, to try to figure out and having them talk to one another. Okay, how do we make this work? How do we work with the union so that we can see that people are being promoted fairly, that the wages are within the same salary band? So I'd say that it is a different way of working, but it's still paying attention. You still have to start from the same place. You'll look at the numbers, and then you have to decide, okay, what am I working with to make this change if we need it? The private sector, and I asked you whether you meant government, because in our private sector, we have a lot of nonprofits too. We are able to report on industries where we get 8 or more companies within the industries to give us. So we did report on nonprofit. They were one of the 5, and we separated actually healthcare from nonprofit. Nonprofit this year had a very low gender wage gap. It was 6 cents. Now, I'll tell you though, they had a very high one in 2021 when we did it during COVID. It was
So how do you
39
parse
cents. There was a lot of press during the pandemic that you may or may not remember about these nonprofits, how they were on the front lines, and then how all of them were being led by men. And when I talked to people here, they said, yep, that's what's happening. The leaders would leave. Instead of promoting from within, they took a CEO from some company thinking that that person would be a great fundraiser and brought them in. And so that's why you saw this discrepancy. We think a lot has changed, at least in Boston. I mean, going from 39 cents to 6 cents is a big deal. Where we didn't see much of the change was the racial wage gap. So people of color is 44 cents in nonprofits. That is because it doesn't seem like people of color are being promoted. They're on the front lines. They still work at nonprofits, but they're not being promoted to the more senior positions. So as kind of like, you look at it by industry, and you have to see what's going on.
So we're talking on Friday, the state legislature, both chambers have passed a wage transparency law that is now before the governor. This applies to companies with more than 25 employees. It says, among other things, that they have to disclose pay ranges on job postings. They have to submit wage data to the state. Can I get your initial take on sort of the substance of the wage transparency law?
I think it is a great first step, and it is wonderful for the state. I will caution that it does not yet include pay data, except for one group in particular who already gives pay data. So you will not be able to look at salary gaps, wage gaps for most of the reporting until the federal government decides to add that to their EEO filings, because remember, it's all going to be based on the EEO filing. Having said that, I think it is great because now many of these companies already give this information to the federal government. So now they're going to give it to the state. But what I'm hoping is the state makes it available in such a form that more research, more studies, more practices can be tested based on the information that is coming out of the reporting. Because it's going to be, again, right from the EEO1 filings. And that would be, and it'll be a lot of data. So that's always good. But again, I caution, it will not have the pay data in there. So we will still be doing the metrics that have to do with wage gap.
I'm fascinated often by how much pay equity depends on openness, either legally required openness or kind of cultural acceptance of openness. Last week, I had two different conversations with reporters about how even in newsrooms, which thrive on sharing information, there's still stigma about discussing pay, and not everybody knows that it's a labor violation to prevent your employees from discussing pay, which many, many, many people don't know, and it's still kind of discouraged along the line of, don't talk about money, politics, or religion at the dinner table. Don't make it weird by talking about pay in the office. Does it feel like there's a change happening, or does it feel like there's still kind of that lingering, I would characterize it, I suppose, as an interest in sort of preserving, company equanimity rather than, increasing the bargaining position specifically of employees. But it feels like there's more understanding about, the need for transparency. Does that seem right, or are there still kind of blockades?
No, I think people, first of all, I think transparency is a big word, and people, and it has a big range. But I don't think discussing salaries is, sort of the same bugaboo that it was years ago. It's more happening. And I also think that many of these laws that you can't ask a person what they were paid before have really helped. There is a study that was done by a BU law professor who saw he went through and he looked at all the ads that were happening for jobs, and he said the pay ranges were much higher because now you didn't have this marker of what they were being paid before. So I think that it has changed quite a bit. I still don't think it's the first thing that's brought up at the table. I also believe, I do think negotiation workshops, teaching people how to negotiate, is important, but it was sort of a symptom of something else where, like, okay, this is the women's fault. They just don't know how to ask for higher raises. No, it's not women's fault. Yes, we could probably be better at some of the questions we ask, but it's not that. It's that I think we're faced with a different agenda when people are interviewing us. So I do think that is starting to change a little too. I think that especially with the idea that people are more welcome in taking a more diverse workforce for whatever reason, for whether they understand that it's a good thing or they feel like their employers, they're pushing it on them. I think that is helping in terms of changing the conversation and allowing for more discussion of salaries.
I think the last thing that I want to hit is that this conversation is happening in the context of lots of discussion about young people coming to Massachusetts, getting educated here, and then leaving because they can't necessarily afford to stay. The living wage here is now substantially higher than it was before. So how is that interacting with these questions of pay equity? The idea that some classes of people are not necessarily as likely demographically to be making that living wage, and therefore we might see more outflow from them.
It's the target of it. It's completely the bullseye of why we do what we do, because this organization was started to keep the best talent in Boston. And we are losing them. We're still losing them. I mean, at that one point, it was working women, but it's anybody working who has talent. We want them to stay here. And I think you're probably referring to the Chamber of Commerce study that was put out that showed just amazingly how many people were going to leave and how many people of color of those people who are leaving said, I can't make the salaries work here. So we talk about it often with our members, and that is one of the reasons we exist, because if you can show people that they're going to be paid fairly, they will stay. And that is something that our employers care about. I mean, they like having our little badge on their website, because then the discussion is brought up by the people they are trying to recruit, who say, well, what's that mean? Like, do you really look at salaries? And they can answer, yes, we are working at it. And this is how much change we've made. So yeah, I think it's a really big issue. And it's one of the reasons that we do what we do.
So what's the next pitch on the table? You said, wage transparency is a good step forward in terms of the policy perspective, or at least the version of it that's going forward is a step. Is there a not silver bullet, but another one that you're pushing for as kind of that next step?
Well, one of the next steps for us is to probably look statewide and get employers all over the state. Right now, for instance, we have a lot of the big employers, but we tell them just to give us Boston, but perhaps we'll go further than that. And this will also be good for employers, because it'll get them ready for when the federal government really does start to mandate, the compensation. So that's one of the things we're looking at, is statewide expansion, which would give us more data. And, we already cover 17% of the employee demographics, but we'd like to get more.
Thanks again to Kim Borman for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. And for more from Commonwealth, you can subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Download, the weekly summary newsletter, The Saturday Send, or our Sunday newsletter with the best of the Commonwealth Voices opinion section. We'll be back next week.